So our transition into parenthood was not a particularly easy one. Some of you know these stories. My wife was ripped out of her normal life, full-time work, out freedom, all the things that we had as a young couple, ripped out of that and then confined into isolation to our small little apartment for weeks on end. And I was clueless. Like, I had held a baby once or twice in my life to that point. I had changed one diaper, and I had actually put it on backwards. Like, I did not know what I was doing. And you know how babies can be so sweet. Not our babies. So our babies cried all the time. All the time. You know that shrieking cry of a newborn baby? Yeah, every time you let your guard down. So we basically didn't sleep for about 11 months, just long enough for Jenny to get pregnant again and us to start the whole process over again. So between sleep deprivation, nonstop crying, you start going crazy. And that all came to a head one famous night where in our little apartment, the only way to get my daughter to stop from crying was to bounce. And we had to walk around our apartment like this. And we were doing this for like hours and we hadn't slept for like a month. And at one point, my wife looks at me and she's just sleep deprived and desperate. And she says, "How long do we keep doing this?" And I was like, "I guess till we die." So at some point in the middle of this season of life, somehow, by a miracle, the baby slept long enough for us to watch a movie. I don't even know how that happened, but we decided to watch a movie, and we chose a movie called Rendition. Not a great movie. Wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It was a really bad choice for the timing, at least. It's like this horrific movie about this guy who was a terror suspect, and so they rip him out of his life, and they throw him into this horrific prison. And this is all in light of that Abu Ghraib stuff, if you remember all of that. So it's terrible. Isolation, confined to this small room, not allowed to sleep, and every time he starts to relax, they like blast him with this piercing noise, and then they force him to get up and walk around his cell, and the whole thing is just this torture. It's haunting. We're like, why did we watch this? And I remember afterwards thinking, wait a second, confinement, isolation, sleep deprivation, piercing noises, that's our life. Like the same tactics that the government agents would use to break a terror suspects, that's the life of a new parent. In fact, if I just described to you, just out of context, just described to you the circumstances my wife was in, you might think I was torturing her. But as soon as I say we're new parents, you start to giggle. Because that kind of torture is not just okay, it's celebrated. So a terror suspect and a new mom might have the exact same circumstances. But the story is totally different. And the story changes everything. So I found this to be true in so many areas of our life, right? The story really, really matters. The story you tell yourself, the story you believe, the story that you're living really, really, really matters. So one person fails, they get fired, rejected, divorced, and that becomes their story. They are a failure, a reject, unloved. But someone else, the exact same thing happens to them, and somehow that's not their story. Somehow they start a new story. Somehow they start a new life. Somehow they move through it. One person has the perfectly boring suburban life in the terrible 1970s house and the minivan, and their kids constantly remind them of everything they don't have. And then someone in the exact same neighborhood lives in the same house, is rocking that minivan, and somehow their kids are still reminding them of all that they don't have, but somehow they live in gratitude, joy, and purpose. Same circumstances, different story. One person suffers abuse as a child, and that becomes their story for the rest of their life. They are a victim. And then you meet my mom. Suffered abuse as a child, but that is not her story. She met Jesus. She built a great marriage. She had 2 godly sons. She went on to travel the world and has devoted over 3 years of her life to ministry. That's her story. Same circumstances, different story, because the story really, really matters. The story you believe, the story you tell yourself, the story you live really, really matters, which begs the question, what story are you living? How do you make sense of your life, our world, our history, our times? How do you make sense of this? What story are you living when you get up each morning? And do you even know? So today we're coming to Daniel chapter 7, and in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel forces us to rethink the story we think we're living. He wants to tell us a story from a different perspective. So the book of Daniel, if you're here at the introduction, it basically breaks into two halves. The first 6 chapters, we get this introduction to these Jewish exiles, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it's these epic stories, these narratives of like the fiery furnace and the handwriting on the wall and the lions and such. But then starting in chapter 7, we encounter something different. It's a bit like Dorothy stepping into Oz, like suddenly everything's technicolor and bizarre. And you're like, we're not in Kansas anymore. Like, this is different. So Daniel's chapter 7 through 12, Daniel sees this series of visions in which God reveals how things look from his perspective. We hear God's story. It's apocalyptic, which literally means unveiling or revealing or exposing. This is where we're invited to peek behind the curtain of human knowledge and see things through God's eyes. This is where we're able to hear the story of our lives and our world as told by God. So before we dive into this section and turn this page and enter the whole new section of Daniel, I do want to have one word on interpretation here. These visions are famously difficult to interpret, so it might be helpful to start with the end of chapter 7 before we dive into the text. Daniel chapter 7, verse 20, the very last verse of the chapter reads like this. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So, if at the end of this message, you are deeply troubled, feel like you're going to faint or maybe puke, you're in good company, right? Maybe you properly understood it. So with that said, let's dive in. Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 1, it begins like this. And the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. So some of you are like, wait a second, Belshazzar, didn't he already die in chapter 5? To which I say, you're brilliant. You should probably go to seminary or something. This is not in chronological order. This vision that we're seeing in Daniel chapter 7 happens before chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall scene. So the vision was probably about 10 years prior to the fall of Babylon, this first year of Belshazzar, which likely places it around 550 or 549 BC. You might recall Belshazzar was not technically the king. He was the son of the king. He was serving as the regent for King Nebuchadnezzar. If you want all the details, go back to that message. But what's significant here, what we need to know for this context of this vision, is the first year of Belshazzar was really, really important and critical for 2 reasons. One, Belshazzar was the beginning of the end. Like everything from his reign, once he sits on the throne in Babylon, it's a death spiral down for the people of Babylon and for everything this world has known at that point. And it marks, that year marks 549 BC is when Cyrus the Persian conquered the Medes and creates the Medo-Persian Empire that starts this earth-shaking army is now tromping about. So from that point on, like everything that they thought was foundational, everything they thought they could count on in the world was suddenly now up for grabs. The whole world is turned upside down. And with that, we see Daniel's dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. So the great sea here is almost certainly a reference, or usually a reference to the Mediterranean. But the fact that giant sea monsters are emerging tells us that this is almost certainly different than your average day at the beach. So here's what I mean. If you lived in ancient Babylon, like Daniel did, or you read ancient Near Eastern literature for fun, like I do, then you know this reference. It's this right here, the Enuma Elish. Here's a copy of it from the British Museum, because they stole all the good things. Right? This is the text. This is the most famous Babylonian myth. This is the Babylonian creation story. This is Anu, the sky god. He calls upon the 4 winds to blow over the great cosmic sea. And then what happens is this beast emerges, Tiamat, this sea dragon, and she is the goddess of chaos, and she is bent on spreading chaos everywhere she goes. But Marduk, the great god of the Babylonians, this storm god, the god of lightning. He gathers his magical bow and he blows his breath into her mouth so that she can't close her mouth, and he shoots his arrows, possibly thunderbolts, which would be cool, into her, and it bursts out her side. It's graphic and gross and disgusting. Then he rips out his knife, cuts her in two, takes half of her and makes the land, and takes half of her and makes the sea. Thus Marduk created everything we see. A little different than Genesis 1. But did you hear it? How it begins. 4 winds blowing on a great sea, and a beast emerges. 4 winds blowing on a great sea, and the beast emerges. You see, the biblical authors, they are not writing in a vacuum. In Daniel's day, to start a story like this is to pull out a pop culture reference. It would be like a pastor singing Coldplay in the middle of a sermon. Like, how ridiculous would that be? You see, the biblical authors, they are not above using pagan language, images, and stories. But I want you to notice how they use it. So, you don't have to write all these down, but for reference sake, if you want to go back to them here, Psalm 74, Psalm 89, Isaiah 27, and Isaiah 51. There are these references to mythical monsters of chaos, but they are not competing gods. They are nations. They are the nations that suppress and oppress God's people. They are Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Or more technically, they are the spiritual forces in and under and behind those political forces. Or take Job 40, 41. We again see these monsters of the deep, Behemoth and Leviathan, but they are not competing with God. In fact, you read the language there, and you see that Yahweh, our God, what does he do? He says, he puts them on a leash, takes them for a walk, he rubs their belly, plays fetch with them like you would with foo-foo. They are not competing forces. God is not afraid of them. There's no battle going on here. Or take Genesis 1. Yes, there's a watery chaos, and there's a wind hovering over it, or spirit, same word, hovering over the waters. But there's no chaos. There's no beast emerging. Creation is not born of violence. It is born of love. It is born of joy. It is good. It is tov. So you might recall, it's not just the genre that divides the book of Daniel, but the languages. That this section of Daniel was written in Imperial Aramaic. It's written in the popular language of the culture. Everyone spoke it. Jews, on the other hand, they only spoke Hebrew. So in this section, in other sections, like we're going to come in chapter 8, that was written for the Jews, just for the Jews. But this is written so that everyone, using popular language, pop culture images, so that everyone's going to hear this and they're going to understand. You know that chaos monster that you thought Marduk took care of once and for all? Well, he's back and brought 3 friends. That's what we're reading. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. So we get the interpretation of this dream in verses like 15 and following, and in an effort not to lose everyone immediately, I'm going to do a bit of interpreting as we go through, okay? So I'm going to pull some of that in. So in verse 17, we are told that these 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms, all right? The first kingdom we see is like a lion with eagle's wings, which just sounds terrifying, as it's supposed to. But again, this is not just some image they pulled off the street. Well, actually, it is an image they pulled off the street. Literally, the main street of Babylon, the processional way, they had these images of lions and lions with wings on the processional way of Babylon. So here's one from British Museum, where you see this. But also, if you've been not just to the British Museum, but to the Met, some of you have, you've seen this. And this is both Assyrian and Babylonian and actually even Persian empires. If you enter into the royal room, they were protected by these guardians, which were, one is a lion with wings and a human face, and one is a bull with wings and a human face. You've seen these images. These are familiar images to ancient people. So traditionally, this first beast, this lion with wings, is identified as Babylon. The plucking of the wings and becoming like a human is a reference to Daniel chapter 4, the episode in which Nebuchadnezzar, he went, remember, insane, became beastly, and then his hair grew literally like the feathers of an eagle. But then he repented. He saw God and became more human than he'd ever been. He became, once again, fully human, right? So this is the image that they think is referencing. Then we get to the next beast. And there before me stood a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." Traditionally, this bear is identified with the Medo-Persian Empire, the empire that came in right after the Babylonians. It's raised up on one side because the Persian portion was the dominant portion. The 3 ribs are usually taken to represent the 3 major conquests of that empire. After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. On its back had 4 wings like those of a bird, and this beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. So the leopard back then, its primary virtue in the ancient world is its speed, and here we see it with 4 wings on it, which is kind of like an ancient Near Eastern way of saying jet propulsion, right? So traditionally, this beast is identified with the Greek Empire, which took over the whole known world with alarming speed. You might know the stories. Alexander the Great, before the age of 30, he conquered everything from the Mediterranean all the way to India. And then it says when he got there, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer, right? But then just 2 years later, in Babylon, quite unexpectedly, he got sick and died. And while he was on his deathbed, they asked him, who's going to take over your kingdom? No one was expecting him to die. Who's going to take this over? And his answer is famously, to the strongest. And so after that, his kingdom gets divided into 4, and there are these 4 generals that take over the entire Greek Empire into 4 sections, and then they battle over who is the strongest. That's the 4 heads of this beast that were given authority to rule. Now, up to this point, you may start to notice something. You're like, we've seen this before. I mean, kind of. Different, but the same. This outline of kingdom upon kingdom is what we saw in Daniel chapter 2. So remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. He saw the history of the world laid out before him. But when he saw it, it looked like this glorious, beautiful image of himself. Nebuchadnezzar. And he sees this golden head and this silver arms and torso, and then the thighs of brass, bronze, and then iron mixed with clay. And those were, we said, traditionally understood as the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greece, and then Roman Empire. That's how Nebuchadnezzar saw history unfolding. But when God sees this exact same scene, he sees it as 4 beasts of chaos that need to be destroyed and put down. Like I said, totally different, but the same. All that to say, when we get to the 4th beast, we are expecting Rome. We know how this happens chronologically through history. We know what comes after the Greek Empire is Rome. But watch this, verse 7. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts and had 10 horns. So we get like this iron teeth image. Like, could that be Rome? Maybe. In verse 24, we learn that the 10 horns are the 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. So we're like, 10 kings, could it be the Caesars? There were traditionally 12 Caesars, was it? Maybe? I don't know. All we can say for sure, though, is that this beast, well, the first one was like a lion, and then like a bear, and like a leopard. This one's not like anything you've ever seen before. That's what marks it. It was different from all the former beasts. And if we miss that in verse 23, it says it again, it will be different from all other kingdoms this world has ever seen. So is that Rome? Maybe. The headline, though, before we move on, don't miss this. The message is really, really clear. Our world is beastly. That is the message we're seeing so far. Apart from God, humanity and human institutions tend to grow in ways that are unnatural, dehumanizing, and terrifying. Apart from God, we will self-destruct. History will end in the collapse of everything that makes us human. That is the headline. Now, there are people who are wont to disagree with this. Most famously, Steven Pinker, famous best-selling author, evolutionary psychologist, Harvard professor Steven Pinker. He argues pretty convincingly that history is progressing, that things are getting better and better. We're becoming less and less violent. Humans are becoming more, not less. In his work, Better Angels of Our Nature, it's his manifesto on human progress. And his argument is basically with enough education, with better government, more Prozac, new technologies, less bullying, we are making the world into a virtual paradise without God. We are recapturing the Garden of Eden without God. That's his argument. Now, for whole periods of time, you might be tempted to agree with Steven Pinker. Maybe you do agree with him. And there is some evidence towards that some things are getting better. The people really might be good, and violence and brutality, dehumanization, that thing might be a thing of the past, and we're entering into this golden era of human prosperity and peace. And then Russia invades the Ukraine. And it's beastly. Or maybe it's more personal for you. Then something happens to your child, and it's beastly. Or then your spouse abandons you, becomes abusive, becomes addicted to pornography, and it's beastly. Or then your spiritual hero has a moral failure. Or then you find yourself doing something that you don't want to do, that you hate, and you keep doing it. And it's beastly. And we are reminded our world is beastly. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little horn, which came up among them. 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, mouth that spoke boastfully. Now this, if you ask me why am I hesitant to label the 4th beast as the Roman Empire, this is why. You see, Daniel describes this little horn that grows up out of the 4th beast. And remember, the horns represent kings or possibly kingdoms. The 4th beast had 10 horns, but this 11th horn, this little horn, grows up and uproots 3 of them. And then this little horn is described as arrogant and boastful and prideful. And it will, in verse 21 and 22, it will wage war against God and his people, and it will defeat them until God himself defeats it. Now we hear this, and I'm like, I'm not so sure we can say that anything in the Roman era fulfills that. In fact, I'm not so sure we're talking about Rome anymore. In verses 24 and 25, the angel explains to Daniel and to us what this little horn is all about, and it reads like this. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. So the 4th beast, whatever this kingdom is, there's these 10 kingdoms that grow up. And after them, another king will arise, the 11th, the little horn. Different from the earlier ones, he will subdue 3 kings. All right? He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. Now, what is that? That is a time, it could be like a year times 2 years and half time, so 3.5 years is what some people think. Or it could be the number 7 is the fullness, idea of fullness or completion throughout the scriptures, especially in apocalyptic literature. 777 is the fullness of something. So 3.5 is for the fullness will be cut in half. It'll be half, cut down in its prime. That's a possible reading of this. Whatever we make of this time, times, and half time, we know that this little horn, this one who is against and opposed to God, will be against God in at least 2 ways. First, he will try to change the set times, which may have to do with Sabbath, or it could be daylight savings time. Did you hear about that this week? Yeah, the U.S. Senate voted to unanimously make daylight savings time permanent, by which I said, God bless America, followed by Marco Rubio just could be the Antichrist. But I'm pretty sure that's not what this text is talking about. More likely, this means that the little horn, this Antichrist, will attempt to rewrite history. He will make himself the end of history. He will entirely try to wipe God from history, from our story. He will entirely try and remove God from the conversation. Can you imagine a world leader who wants to remove God from history, remove God from everything we understand about ourselves, remove God from time itself, no longer let Jesus Christ define BC and AD? Can you imagine? And second, he will try to change laws. He will construct a morality that is not based on God. He will redefine what it means to be human. He will redefine when life begins. He will redefine what is good and what is bad. He will construct his own morality apart from God. He will create a law for himself that has nothing to do with God. Can you imagine an arrogant world leader who would be completely opposed to God, try to wipe God from the conversation of history, of schools, of everything, of time itself, and then try and construct a morality that no longer is rooted in God? Can you imagine? Yeah. For a long time, this was unimaginable. But now it sounds bizarrely reasonable, doesn't it? So this language, this imagery, this little horn, here's the thing. It's not just an oddity of the book of Daniel. This figure comes up again and again, variously in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul refers to the same figure as the one who's going to try and change laws as the man of lawlessness, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The Apostle John famously refers to him in 1 John, his first letter, as Antichrist. But the most complete description we find of this character is in Revelation chapter 13. Here, all the images that Daniel uses come back, but in a new way. John sees this dragon, get this, a dragon standing by the sea, and out of the sea emerges this terrible beast with 10 horns. And listen how John refers to this beast. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and mouth like that of a lion. Do you see it? That this Antichrist is pictured as a beast who somehow incorporates all the previous beastly kingdoms of this world. Like he's not just the last one in line, but he is the culmination of everything that this world has been trying to do to overthrow God. He's the culmination of all the human attempts to live apart from God since the beginning. And in verse 5, we could get this description. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for how long? 42 months. That, let's see, 12 months in the year. That's 12 plus 12 plus 12 plus 6. That would be a time times and half time, 3.5 years. In verse 6, it opened its mouth to blaspheme God and slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them, and it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So this beast of Revelation chapter 13, the little horn of Daniel 7, the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians, Antichrist of 1 John, they all appear to be one and the same. And the number of his name? It is 666. Which brings us back to the question, who is this little horn? Who is this figure, this Antichrist? Well, if I had lived in around 160 BC, I would have said for certain this character is Antiochus Epiphanes. You may never have heard of him, but he was horrific. He tried to de-Judaize the Jews. I would have said, that's the guy. That's the man. And we'll talk more about him next week. But if I had lived around 70 AD, well, if I had lived in the late 60 ADs, I would have said it was Nero who had the Apostle Paul and Peter had their heads chopped off or Peter crucified upside down. If I had lived slightly after that in 70 AD, I would have said it was Titus because he came in, he destroyed Jerusalem. He overturned every last stone. To fulfill prophecy, every last stone in the temple, I would have said it was him. But if I waited just a little later, I would have said, no, it's Trajan, because he said, anyone who does not declare Caesar as Lord must be killed. But if I had lived in the Middle Ages, I would have said it was one of the bad popes. If I had lived in the 1940s, I would have said it's Hitler. In fact, it's hard to find an era in history when someone doesn't fit this description. And John says as much. In 1 John, he says it like this. As you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, this little horn, he is coming, the one who will be opposed to God. This figure is coming. But even now, many antichrists have come. So he is coming, but many have come. He is coming. There is one, there is a figure who will come. But his spirit, the spirit of Antichrist, is already at work again and again and again, over and over, has already come many times. So how do we put this together? These 4 beasts, 10 horns, little horn. Like, how do we make sense of all this? And then what is this supposed to tell us about our story, the story we find ourselves in? So I want to lay out kind of the 4 major options for like how to interpret this, and then tell you the right one. So the first one is the historic fulfillment option. And this is to say, hey, if you look back in history, this is clearly 70 AD, this happened then, or this is clearly 164 BC, something like that. You pick a time and you say, hey, we can see how all this fits into that time frame. That's what it was referring to. And there's something to this. There is something to this. You need to look back in history and you can see fulfillments of this already have happened, right? The next one is the future fulfillment. And this is the argument that, hey, suddenly lost my thing. Let me see if I can restart that. Hey, there we go. Some argue that the whole scene is yet to happen. So the lion with eagle's wings is clearly America, right? And then the bear is clearly Putin and Russia. And so this is where you get into the crazy views of like anyone can make it up. So just this last week, I heard a pastor say, well, we knew that Russia would invade Ukraine because it said so in Daniel chapter 7. I'm like, really? Because I've read that thing once or twice or 100 times. So to be perfectly frank, I find these interpretations slightly ridiculous, and they tend to say more about the interpreter than the text. The third one is something I want you to take seriously. It's called the pattern of history option. So some argue that this is not meant to tell us about specific kingdoms necessarily, but 4 kingdoms theme. This 4 kingdom theme is a theme that you would find actually across the ancient world. You find this in you find this theme of people laying out history in 4 kingdoms in various settings. So some think that Daniel's just picking up this theme to show us, hey, you've already heard this theme, but now I'm going to tell you the true meaning of history. I'm going to tell you where history is really headed. So there's something to this. Again, this would be similar to what John is saying. Antichrist has already come. That's a pattern that's ultimately going to be fulfilled in the Antichrist. So it's a pattern that is pointing us towards the ultimate end of history. That's the option. And then the last one is, you got to follow me here. It's the prophetic clock is stuck option. If you're into theology at all or whatever, you might know the term dispensational. This is the dispensational option. This is the idea that the 4 beasts are exactly who you think they are. They're Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. And the whole thing was supposed to end at the Roman Empire. It was supposed to. It was all headed that way. It was going to end at that time. It was supposed to usher in, the Messiah was supposed to come. It's supposed to usher in into that time, this period of God's kingdom on earth, a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity, what we know as the millennial kingdom. But something happened, something unexpected. God's people, the Jews, rejected their own Messiah. And that, the clock got stuck. They rejected the Messiah, and this mystery happened. The Apostle Paul calls it a mystery, the mystery of the church age, that suddenly no one in the Old Testament ever saw this coming. So what happens is there's this pause. Suddenly, the message that went out that God's people are going to be saved, the Jews, you have to become Jewish to be saved, suddenly that gets put on pause. The Jews are set aside, and now God focuses it on bringing the gospel to the whole world, gathering together people from every tribe, tongue, language. And so, because the Jews rejected their Messiah, God has opened up this church age, or the time of the Gentiles. And then when that is done, and we will not know, at the time when we least expect it, it will be over, the clock will restart. One day, when we least expect it, the clock will start back up, and then time will run out under a revived Roman Empire, and the rest of prophecy, the 7 years of human history that are left, will play out. And the marker that this 7 years, that we're in those 7 years, is the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. You will see what the Apostle Paul refers to, and Daniel refers to, and Jesus refers to as the abomination that causes desolation. That is the marker. Time is out, buds. So, Which view? Now, I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, and I paid good money to believe this option. But let me be perfectly honest, perfectly frank here. The more I've studied, I don't know. If I just had my Bible and my theology books, I would actually toss this option out entirely. I really would. I would go with option number 3. If I just had my Bible and theology books, I would say that Daniel is giving us a historical pattern of what has been happening across time that will one day culminate in the end of time so that we can make sense of our stories where we find ourselves living, so that we can make sense of our current world, so that we can make sense of evil, suffering, hardship, and the view in light of what God is doing in history. That's what I would think if I just had my Bible and theology. But there's one little thing that makes me pause on this and say, I'm not so sure. It's the nation of Israel. You see, 70 AD, the Romans wiped Israel off the face of the planet. I mean, they completely destroyed everything. They killed everyone. They leveled everything. You should read Josephus on it. It's horrifying. But now, 1,878 years later, the nation that did not exist in 1948, it exists. Well, the world's never seen anything like this, for a nation to cease to exist entirely and then to come back after 1,878 years. This is miraculous. It feels like the prophetic clock has started again. So there's that. It's almost like at any moment, these things that seem like they were mere historical patterns might literally come true. So I don't want to put too much emphasis on either side, but we'll explore this more in weeks to come. Here's where I want you to come down on this, though. Whatever view you happen to take on these beasts and the horns and the little horn, here's why I don't think we should make too big of a deal out of this. Because, and I want you to hear this, it almost doesn't matter how you view the beast or the little horn if you get the last part of the vision right. If you get the last part of the vision right, I don't care what you believe about the other parts. You know, the world's beastly. Okay. Watch this. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothes were as white as snow, and the hair of his head was white as wool. His throne was flaming with fire. Its wheels were all ablaze. We enter in, we're from this little horn, suddenly we're thrown into the throne room of God, the Ancient of Days, and he is timeless, and he is eternal. He is wisdom in the flesh, and he is not threatened at all by this little horn. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. These innumerable crowds. And the court was seated, and the books were opened, because he alone can define history. He alone is judge. He alone can define what it means to be human. He alone can tell you who you are. He alone is judge. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. This little horn is still yapping away. I kept looking till the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beast had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. So we don't get the full description here, but the Apostle Paul describes it as the Messiah will do away with the Antichrist the way you might blow dust off your hand. It's nothing. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. It literally says he was a son of Adam. He's a human. But he's coming on the clouds. This is language that is only ever used of divinity. He was given authority, glory, sovereign power, and all nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, one that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And this This Son of Man, this God-man who sits in the very presence of God, is given all authority, will gather a people from every tribe and tongue and nation, and he will lead us into paradise under God. He will give us peace, justice, freedom, wholeness, shalom. He is king forever and ever. And this is the end of history. This is the point of your story. This is why you exist. This is where everything in life, this is where you are headed one day. This is where the universe is headed. The beasts, they will come and go. They will make great claims on your life. They will attempt to define you and enslave you. They will demand your worship and entice you to follow them. And if you refuse, they will threaten you. And if you still refuse, they will persecute you. And if they still refuse, they will kill you. But in the end, they will not last. They will collapse upon themselves. They will be blown away. And nothing they have done will last. Their claims will not stand. Their laws will not hold. They will be tossed like branches into the fire. And the Son of Man, he changes the headline. No longer is it the world is beastly, but fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. That is the new headline. The beast is gone. And to quote Revelation chapter 11, verse 15, the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. Babylon is fallen. The beast is gone. It has no power. But our King, he will live and he will rule forever and ever. Now, how does this story make you rethink the story you are living? How might this help Daniel and help us make sense of our life and our times? Well, for Daniel and the apostles and the earliest Christians, it was pretty dramatic. You see, they were all persecuted for their faith, and this story changed everything. It gave them a courage to die. It gave them a courage to resist the pressures and temptations of this world. It gave them the courage to no longer seek the things that this world seeks because they know that it's passing away. It gave them a reason for hope when everyone and everything was against them. It gave the Apostle Paul the ability to write in prison, facing his own death, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say, rejoice." It made them unconquerable. It gave them a peace that passes understanding. It gave them a hope, an assurance, and a joy that this world does not know and cannot take away. Cannot. The beast has no power over that because it comes from a different kingdom, from a different king. So knowing that the beast is temporary, knowing that the Son of Man is going to be victorious, he's already victorious, knowing that's where our life is headed, knowing the story that we are living in changes everything. And we know something that Daniel didn't know. We know something that Daniel couldn't even imagine, that 583 years after this vision, after this dream, a Son of Man would stand before the rulers of his world that day, before the religious authorities, before the beastly kingdom, and the high priest of that day would ask him a question. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Are you claiming to be the king who's going to overthrow Rome and going to usher in God's peace? Are you really that audacious to think you're that person?" And his answer, "I am." Now, it could just mean I am. Or it could be the sacred name of God, Yahweh. I am that I am. But in case there's any question, he's going to follow this up. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." He quotes Daniel chapter 7. I am the God-man that Daniel saw in his vision. I will sit on God's throne forever and rule as king, and there's nothing you can do to take that away. I am the author of history. No one takes my life from me. I lay it down. So we know not only the end of history, we know the Son of Man. We know that our King did not abandon us in our suffering, but he joined us in it. We know that we are loved deeply loved, so deeply loved that he would come after us, lay down his life for us. We know that we are not alone in our hardship because he promised, I will be with you always. We know that he will never forsake us, that no matter what we go through, he has promised, I'm coming for you, I'm coming for you, I'm coming for you. We know Jesus. Or at least we're invited to know Jesus. We're invited into this story. So we have a lot more evidence than Daniel ever had. We have the witness of the apostles all about Jesus, his life, death, resurrection. We have all this witness down through the ages of the church, of people who've lived lives in this story, who've been caught up in this. But like Daniel and the apostles, we too are still waiting for this to be fulfilled. And our world is still beastly. And until Jesus returns, till the Son of Man comes on the clouds, we have to live this story not by sight, but by faith. So we must reject the beastly voices that want to wipe God out from our society and from our lives, that want to remove God from everything. We have to reject those beastly voices that want to redefine morality apart from God, that promise you freedom, that will enslave you and dehumanize you. We must cling to the gospel, the story revealed by God to Daniel and Paul and Peter and John and Mark. We must relax and trust that the same humble, sacrificial, gentle Jesus of Nazareth will return, as he promised, on the clouds, the glorious Son of Man. But if by faith you believe this story, if you live into this story, it means letting go of control. It means you can no longer be the author of your own story. You're not. He is. It means you can no longer define what is true for you. He defines truth. It means you can no longer be in control. He is. He is your king. He is the author of history. He is your life. And this means that your life might not look like what you want it to look like, and it might mean suffering, and it might mean persecution. If you're deeply troubled by this and feel like you might faint or puke, you're in good company. Father, we pray today that you would give us eyes of faith to see Jesus for who he is, to see his kingdom that is now and not yet, to see the world for what it is, to see the beastly attempts that are trying to dehumanize us and turn us away from you and make us into less, not more, the false promises of this world for paradise without you. God, may we be like the psalmist who says we'll give up everything. Just better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere, Lord. You are what we want. We want to be with you. We want Jesus to be our king. We want the peace that only he can give, the hope that only he can give, and not these false promises of the world. God, give us wisdom, give us faith, give us hope. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.